Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. This week's video is my end of year wrap-up video where I'm going to be talking to you about all of my reading stats for the year and about my reading goals, about whether I achieved them or not, and about how I felt about my reading year. So I'm going to start off by telling you that I did not achieve my reading goals. Well, I didn't achieve one of them. So my reading goals for this year were to read 40 books, to read books in other languages, and to read more books from different countries. So I did not read 40 books this year. And even though there are still 3 days left till the end of the year, I'm not going to be able to finish the book that I'm currently reading in that time. I don't think, at least. Maybe I might surprise myself, but I don't think so. In terms of reading books in other languages, I read one book in German. So technically, I did complete that goal. Although I would have liked to have read more books in other languages, but that's just how it turned out. And then to read more books from different countries. I can say I completed that goal, but the thing is I don't know what my stats were in terms of reading books from different countries in previous years because I've never tracked that before. So I don't know what it is compared to what it used to be. But the thing with that goal specifically was that I didn't want to be just reading books that were either from the UK or say from England, let's say, or from the US. I wanted to broaden my reading horizons in terms of where the authors are from and where the stories are set. So in terms of doing that, I read 12 out of the 36 that I did read are from not the UK or not England and not the US. Although, I mean, not the UK because I don't know that I differentiated between Scotland and England and Wales. I don't think I read anything by a Welsh author. I'm also not sure that I read anything by a Scottish author. But I did keep Ireland separate from the rest of the UK because part of Ireland is and the other part is not, but I just kept them all separate. So in terms of that, I did pretty good. I'm happy with myself. I didn't read 40 books, but I got pretty close. That out of the way, we can move on to some stats. As you've just heard, I read 36 books this year, which is one book less than I read last year, which is a little bit upsetting because I do feel like I was reading more this year, but maybe I also read longer books this year, so that might also have contributed. Well, I know it did contribute. And of those books, 67% were 300 pages or less, 25% were between 300 and 499 pages, and 8% were 500 pages or more. And those 8%, I'm pretty sure, is just The Secret History by Donna Tartt and Die Geschichte der Bienen by Maya Lunde. I think those are the only two books I read that are over 500 pages long. In terms of fiction versus non-fiction, fiction won out by a mile, as it always does. I always read more fiction than I do non-fiction, but my fiction was 69% of my reading this year, and non-fiction was 31%, which I think is the most non-fiction I've also read in a year, potentially. And the non-fiction that I read this year I actually enjoyed, so I'm very happy about that. In terms of genres, my top genre, as always, is literary fiction. By a mile, I read 13 books in the literary fiction genre. Then second on the list is LGBTQIA+ books. Then contemporary, classics, and historical are all even, with 5 books each. LGBTQ was 7 books. I think this is pretty much on par with what I read last year. I think last year I also had literary, LGBTQ, contemporary, classics, and historical, except that maybe historical and classics might have been swapped last year. But I mean, I read the same number of books in both categories, so it doesn't really matter. Then in terms of format, 28% of my reading was on audiobook, and 72% of my reading was in print. I didn't read any ebooks this year, but next year that is going to be changing. And then in terms of languages, as we've all heard, I only read one book that was not in English, or at least not in English or translated into English. So in terms of languages, English made up 97.2% of my reading and German made up 2.8% of my reading. So hopefully next year, definitely next year, I will be reading more books in German, because I already have 2 new books in German that I'm going to be reading. And then my average star rating that I gave all the books that I read this year is 3.99, which is a pretty good average rating considering how I feel about my reading this year. But it seems that I did enjoy, according to my star rating. Maybe I'm just too nice in my star ratings and I give books really good star ratings even though I feel middling about them, maybe? I don't know. I also try to keep in mind when I'm rating a book what other books I have read this year and what I've rated them, and compare it with that. But as you can tell, I kind of feel middling about my reading this year. I feel like I read a lot of books that I expected to be better than they were. And maybe that's just because I've had them on my bookshelf for so long and have been kind of imagining what the story would be like for a while, and then it doesn't live up to my expectations, or it is a completely different story to what I was imagining it was going to be. So in terms of my reading this year, I kind of feel like I didn't really like most of what I read. It was okay, like it was meh. I didn't have strong negative feelings towards it, but I also didn't have any strong positive feelings towards most of what I read this year. So that was kind of a letdown. And I'm hoping that next year my feelings towards the books that I read will be better, even though my average rating this year seems to say that I read a lot of good books. Technically, you can read good books and not enjoy them, because when I rate a book, I also kind of try to objectively rate it based on how good of a book I thought it was, regardless of whether or not I actually enjoyed it or liked it. Because sometimes I have read books where I'm like, this was objectively a really good book and really well written and a really good story. I just didn't enjoy it. So I kind of keep a lot of things in mind when I'm rating a book, actually, now that I think about it, or now that I have to explain how I rate books. So yes, that was kind of all of my little reading wrap-up of the year. I hope that next year's reading is going to be more satisfying for me. I'm not going to be talking about my plans for next year's reading in this video, because I have a video coming out next week where I will be talking about all of my reading goals for next year and planning my reading journal and all those kinds of things. If you want to give me a short wrap-up of your reading year in the comment section down below, please do, because I really like seeing what other people's reading years have been like and what maybe their favorite books have been and all those kinds of things. So if you want to share that with me, I would be very happy to see it. Otherwise, I will see you all again next year with a new video. Until then, cheers.